Hey guys, and welcome back to Interrupting Sports. This is Season 2, Episode 7, and today we're diving into our top 10 questions for a Q&A period. Last week, I shared on our Instagram at Interrupting Sports, as well as our Facebook and our LinkedIn, DM'd a bunch of you guys as well to find out if you guys had any questions for the podcast or for me as the host and producer. So with that, I got tons of responses. So first off, want to thank everybody for taking the time out of their day. I know it's a busy period for everyone, so thank you for filling that out. And I'm so excited to dive into those questions because, guys, I was so excited just going through each one and just jotting down some notes for my responses. And let me tell you, I'm super excited to provide you guys with those answers. So let's dive right into the top 10 questions. All right, now beginning with our first question. First question reads, what was your inspiration for starting a podcast? How do you see your podcast evolving in the future? I actually got a few responses on this one, so just grouping it together here. Essentially, all of this started from me waking up one day and wanting to do more. It really stemmed from a fact of I felt like I wasn't doing enough in my life in general. I was like, okay, like I'm waking up, I'm gonna go work out, go to class, go to work, say hi to my dog, and just, go to bed. I felt like there was something missing. And throughout, honestly, the pandemic, I found myself searching for something more. And that's really how I landed on wanting to build something on my own and contribute to something meaningful. And I realized that can stem from a fact of wanting to have an impact. And so I made it a mission to educate myself and to educate my peers. And with everything that was going on in the world, especially stemming from George Floyd's death, I realized that I could have something to say in this space of a cultural movement in sports. And so that is where that inspiration came from. If you want to hear the whole story, though, I invite you to check out the first official episode of this show, episode 1, season 1, Identity and Inclusion. That is where I share my story about how the podcast got started, why, where I'm coming from, all of that. That background's all outlined in there, so definitely invite you guys to check that out. In terms of how do I see my podcast evolving in the future, really honestly, I've been giving this a lot of thought. We're wrapping up season 2 in a few weeks now, and I'm really looking at where do I see this going? What is the point here? We've started to shed a light on a few voices here. We're getting some conversations started. All great stuff, but what is the end goal? And at the point I am at right now, what I've been thinking is developing a network. So a network that encompasses all aspects of positive change. So think of, for every individual, there's more to sports that can be interrupted. And that's the idea. I would like to develop an entire network that focuses on whether it's mindset, nutrition, physical health, academia, personal finance, lifestyle, creativity. The possibilities are endless. Really, the point is, what else needs to be interrupted in our lives that requires this motivation and inspiration for positive change, and someone who can be the voice to help each individual, whether you're BIPOC or not, each individual become the best version of themselves. And that is exactly what I'm trying to build. That's the vision, guys. So keep supporting me, keep spreading the word, and let's build this together. Question 2. Are you excited for the 2022 Winter Olympics? Absolutely, I'm excited. I am stoked. I am so hyped, guys. I can't wait. I absolutely love the Winter Olympics. I love the Olympics. Earlier, actually, I believe it was one of the earlier episodes of season 1 of this show, I talked about the Olympic Games effect. That's something that I call, and it's just when everybody's coming together, different nations, all same sports, doesn't matter what's happening in the world, but there's a commonality of having that same identity and having that importance and celebration of coming together through sport, and I love it. It's my favorite time of year for that instance where you realize that feeling in that moment. Everybody feeling connected and feeling supported. Love it. So yes, in hindsight, I am definitely excited for the 2022 Olympics. For those of you who don't know, The Olympics this year is actually going to be back in Beijing, China. So Beijing will be the first city ever to host both the Summer and the Winter Olympics. Olympics will be held in the beginning of February. I believe it's the 4th that we're looking at starting the games. So stay tuned for those opening ceremonies. I don't really know about you guys, but I love the opening ceremonies. Closing ceremonies, I'm not going to lie, I'm not that devoted to stay around for the closing ceremonies by that time. I kind of hop back on at the Paralympics. But opening ceremonies, I'm there. I love it. I just love seeing just the grand and just vast presentation of culture in sport. Like, it's amazing the show that's put on. So that's what I love. In terms of sports, obviously, guys, coming from a hockey background, I'm super stoked for women's hockey, men's hockey as well, but super stoked for women's hockey, especially, looking at the Canada-US rivalry that's always there. But one thing I absolutely love about the Olympics is just getting a chance to get some visibility into sports that I don't follow or I don't play or have any kind of knowledge about. So, for example, skiing, especially like ski jumping, snowboarding, bobsledding, all of those sports I'm just absolutely fascinated with, and I could watch them all day. I love it. And so I'm super excited to kind of dive into that. I love just having it playing throughout the day. I'm a big follower of the Olympics app, that kind of thing. So definitely excited for the Olympics. Hope you guys are too. Don't forget about the Paralympics. The Paralympics is something that is too undermined in our society, guys. Think about it. Like, I celebrate myself getting out of bed in the morning. Meanwhile, the world doesn't celebrate Olympians who have disabled bodies or whatever they face, and they are literally professional athletes competing on an international scale, and that's not a big deal. So I just wanted to put that out there, guys. Stay tuned for the Paralympics. Show them some love. They deserve it. Question 3. Is inequity in youth sports a problem? If so, how can we increase inclusion in youth sports, especially expensive sports like competitive hockey? Yes. The answer is yes, with a capital YES. Put a couple exclamation points on there and an emoji, because yes, there's definitely inequity in youth sports. It's actually something that I talk about a lot about on the show. Really, the gist of the answer is the inequity stems from youth sports, and it's a reflection of the lack of representation in the professional leagues. So from a solution perspective, what we're talking about is we need to promote inclusion in the grassroots program, so the minor leagues, while simultaneously improving representation in the professional leagues. So not only are you developing those figureheads, those athletes that will inspire youth to want to work their way up to becoming professional athletes or just see themselves as someone who can be successful no matter what they look like or where they come from or who they are. And simultaneously opening up those youth programs to say, hey, you are welcome here, come check it out. That is essentially the solution that comes into play. But if you want to find out more about that, definitely check out season 1 and 2. In season 1, episode 4, Hockey for Everyone. Episode 5 of season 1, Promoting Inclusion in Sports. Season 2, episode 1, we have Life as a Varsity Athlete with the Ryerson Rams goalie Natalie Thompson, one of my closest friends. And we have episode 6, last week's episode from season 2, Moment of Truth. And that was with Coach Jason Meglante. Great conversation there, all about youth sports, all about promoting inclusion, talking about hockey throughout there as well. So definitely a great spot for you to take a look at. Question 4. What are some common misconceptions you believe people may have about BIPOC representation and athlete activism in sports? I love this question. Love this question because you get the blood boiling. You guys are going to hear a lot from me right now. So get comfortable. The first one is promoting Black Lives Matter, equity, BIPOC representation is a fad or trend. I hate hearing that because it's not. You guys think because maybe the pandemic, everyone's home, or everyone's got their eyes open, ears open right now, that they're listening to us, especially with all that stemmed from George Floyd and everyone else who we've failed to mention countlessly. That isn't true. You have simply begun to hear us. There is a difference. This isn't a fad, this isn't a trend. As the world enters its new normal, we will only continue to be louder and continue to be more authentic and continue to be more intentional about our communication with this cultural movement. So just watch, just wait. If you're sick of it, too bad, because guess what we're sick of? Guess what every BIPOC member and everyone else who's marginalized and underrepresented in society is tired of? Being excluded, being walked over, being looked past, being treated differently. So when you say it's a fad or a trend, I say it's just the beginning. Number 2, another misconception I find is the belief that every Black athlete must be screaming Black Lives Matter or else. And look, it has to be understood that activism isn't for everyone. You are not obligated to be an activist, no matter what group you form to. The reason I say that is because activism is only efficient if it's authentic. Authenticity matters, truly, because how are you supposed to inspire and motivate change when it doesn't fuel you? If that is what fuels you, you will speak and resonate with others. And that is what changes mindsets. And that change in mindsets is what changes actions. And actions then lead to changes in systems, which leads to difference making and equality, and more importantly, equity. So, should every Black athlete scream Black Lives Matter? Well, if it matters to them, yes. An important just side note about this is we're not saying that if you're not screaming Black Lives Matter, you're not preaching that. That doesn't mean you're not supportive. Of course, every single BIPOC member faces the discrimination of the community, whether they choose to voice it or not. All we're doing right now, like I am with this platform and this podcast, is saying, hey, here's a space for you to do so, because we understand, and I understand, that you may feel uncomfortable in this space. That is what's being done. So authenticity matters as an athlete activist, and that's just something I would love people to keep in mind. The third misconception that I hear, or at least that I interpret, is that we, as in the BIPOC community, are simply complaining. And we're nagging on and on. We get it, slavery, racism, discrimination, okay, yeah, like things need to change, we get it. But like, can we go back to work now? And the reason I love these complaints is because it means one thing. You hear us. You hear us. If you are at a point where you think we're complaining, that means that it feels like we are annoying you. Which means I'm doing exactly what I should be doing, and we are doing exactly what we should be doing, because you are hearing something that is challenging the status quo and challenging what is acceptable in society. So how I challenge what you call a complaint, I call change. People complain because they don't like change. But change is coming, whether you're ready or not. So we will continue to voice our opinions, and we'll continue to be loud, and we'll continue to ensure that you hear us, because that's how we understand that we're doing the right thing. Question number 5. What does change look like? I find myself quite uninformed by just reading headlines and stories about sports from the news, and thus I'm not sure what to necessarily look for in these stories to understand what the impact actually is. That is a great question. You know, there's an abundance of information in the media, and it's consuming and it's overwhelming, and you don't know what to look for, you don't know what to believe. And I think we found this outside of even this cultural movement that we're constantly talking about in EDI. Looking at COVID alone, you can see just the mass news and so much information that you don't know where to look and what's real and what's authentic. So coming back to EDI here, how you analyze impact. What I think is change in policy, change in hiring practices. Look at entry-level hires. Who is being hired? And more importantly, who is being promoted to decision-making power? Because that's the influence that you need to promote change. You can hire all Black people, if you wanted to. All South Asians, if you wanted to. Put them all in entry-level positions. But if they're not moving up, you're actually not changing anything. Because issue is that the decisions, the critical decisions which decide how we live our lives, is made by a common person who tends to be the white individual. So C-suite changes, those executive teams, that's where you're really going to see that change. As well, I would argue if you notice changes in formal education practices or even training for underserved communities, because you might find that, for example, in underserved communities, why aren't there more Black doctors that come out of this communities? Well, because what education and training is there for them to get to those levels, let alone representation. You also have to look at the resources to gaining that traction. So that's how you surpass those systemic barriers. So if you see those kind of efforts, that's what's going to make that change. But from a news perspective, I would say news is a great tool to inform yourself of current events. But just be mindful with the news, because what is written about in the news, what is talked about, is based on what was decided is considered newsworthy. What does that mean? I don't know. I'm not a writer. I'm not a sports writer. I'm not a journalist. I'm just letting you know from a consumer's perspective, they decided, hey, this is going to be a big deal to our listeners and to our watchers. We're going to talk about this. Not, this is something everyone should be made aware of because it's important. There's a different mindset there. I'd say that that's coming up on a little bit of on a local sort of fashion. You find a lot of niche voices trying to be more authentic in that way. But for the most part, that is where we're at right now. So I invite you, investigate what is not being written about. Take a look from an EDI perspective, because everyone may be screaming Black Lives Matter, EDI, diversity, inclusion, hiring practices, mandates, policies, all of that. But look at, say, the board of directors for most corporations and come back to me with what you think, because that is the best way I can explain this to you, is by seeing it for yourself. Look at what's being put out there and look at what's not being done. And tell me if you see that discrepancy and why it's there, and if change is actually happening, or if it's happening fast enough, or if we're doing the right things. Question number 6. How can sports entertainment consumers impact change? Are there better or worse ways to do so? Great question. We covered this actually in a recent episode. If you check out season 2, episode 3, The Importance of Fans, it's actually with my brother and the most devoted sports fan that I know, Justin Lambie. We talk about just how you're consuming entertainment as a fan and the role you have as a fan. So that's a great place to check out. But essentially the gist is, as a fan and consumer of sports and entertainment, you have power in numbers. So with that collective voice, you have an influential voice. And so it's up to you to use that to hold leagues, teams, players, and just others accountable, because they will listen to you given the representation that you have in the sporting community. Number 7, in the hopeful event that I get to become a leader in the sports industry, what should I do to incorporate a diverse mindset into my team? It's easy to hire to quotas, but how can I drive my team past that to really make everyone feel valued and bring out the best in others? Phenomenal question. You're completely right. Like, quotas are a great step. I understand the ideology behind it. And yeah, with quotas, you'll end up with X number of BIPOC members. But is that really all we can do? The answer is no. How I look at it, if I was in a position where I was a recruiter, I actually wouldn't focus on diversity. I wouldn't. I just wouldn't focus on hiring for something we call cultural fit. And that means just hiring for someone to fit the organization. They're like, does this person really, And the reason that's a problem is because it leads to something called hire like me bias. And it means that you are looking for someone that fits the current state of the organization. But hello, wake up. The problem is the current state of the organization. So if you're hiring for the current state of the organization, no change is coming. So Don't focus on cultural fit, but also don't focus on diversity. Don't focus on, okay, because we don't want everyone to fit in this organization exactly how it stands. Don't want to have that hire like me bias. We want to limit as much as possible. Let's just look for everyone who's completely different and let's just bring them on. No, that's also not how it's done. I don't have the perfect answer for you, but I have something that at least is food for thought. I argue that you should look for breadth in experiences and abilities, because when you're focused on who is bringing something different to the table from an experiential standpoint and from an abilities and capabilities standpoint, and the reason I say that is because breadth in ability, that stems from differences in life experiences, maybe where they worked, who they worked with, where they were in the world, and that is derived from differences in cultural heritage and personal identity. So indirectly, you end up hiring for diversity without focusing on diversity. Because what happens is you can focus and channel all your energy into diversity, but then you're missing something. There's a big gap there in ability. And then what happens is you see the complaints, oh, more training is needed because the people we're hiring don't have the necessary training. Oh, that stems from systemic changes because their underserved communities don't have the necessary resources and formal education. Okay, yes, but also that can be eliminated or at least limited in the sense of the lens that you are hiring for. So I argue, look for breadth and focus on differences in experiences and abilities and see how that can be brought to the table, and then take a step back and look at, hey, we actually ended up hiring 4 out of 6 people as women, and guess what? Like 7 out of 8 people from our next round of hiring happen to be the BIPOC community, or maybe they don't. Who knows what the numbers will look like? But the point is that it's random and it's everyone. And that's really the key factor. It's everyone. You want to represent everyone, but you can't represent everyone by only looking for someone. You have to look for everyone. And the best way to do that is how I mentioned, and it's not the full solution, but I think it's a better step in the direction from quotas. Number 8, what is the biggest change you'd like to see in broadcasting of professional sports? WOMEN. Women. The representation of women. The representation of female sports. The representation of professional female athletes. The representation of professional female athletes in the BIPOC community, in the LGBTQ plus community. The representation of women. That is the biggest change I'd like to see. I've advocated for this before. If you check out season 1, episode 11, professional female athletes, you will definitely hear a lot of talk there. Let me just ask you a question. Instead of telling you why, let me just ask you a question. Do you know how to watch the Toronto Six play? Actually, even worse, I'd put money down right now to bet most of you listening don't even know what team that is. And that right there, that is the biggest problem in broadcasting. So go check out season 1, episode 11, professional female athletes, and you'll understand why I argue that the biggest change in broadcasting for professional sports is a representation of women. Question 9. As a soccer fan, a lot of nations for years have stigmatized players because of their race, citizenship, etc., and not called upon them due to this, even if they have a lot of skill. Do you think as globalization progresses and nations like Canada, that are relatively racially inclusive in terms of sports, move towards the top of the rankings, this will no longer be a problem? This is a nice hefty question, and honestly a fair one as well, because, we're in a position where we're trying to inspire and motivate people. And when I say we, I mean myself, I mean other content creators and other voices that are advocating for EDI. And unfortunately, I argue this. Culture embeds norms and practices in society. The culture of sport varies across nations. So the culture in Canada in terms of sports is very different from the culture for a European country in terms of sports. And that's not even just from a representation lens, from an EDI lens. Norms in general, rules and regulations, right? The perspective of fans in society as well. Like there's tons and tons that goes into that. So unfortunately, I believe that even if Canada becomes one day the ideal representative of inclusion in sports, that alone is not enough to progress other nations. It will, however, or it may, hopefully, I would love to think that if Canada would reach this stage, or any other country for that matter, inspiration may come and motivation as well would follow. But ultimately, for any nation, any culture, ultimately it is the voices of the people that are represented and served in that community that must be the ones leading the fight. And the reason that is true is because change in the community is led by the community. Change in the community is led by the community. If it is not, you are serving a different community. So that is my answer to that question. I believe we all have a responsibility in terms of representatives of our country and citizens to do our best to progress this. But when you're looking across borders, we shouldn't stop this fight. We should continue to advocate all around the world. However, what we should really focus on is motivating the people of other nations to do the same for their own nation and supporting them in doing so, because their voice will be a lot more influential there than yours will. Now for our last question, question number 10, we're ending it off lightly. What is my favorite thing about hosting this podcast? My favorite thing about this podcast, no matter how busy I get, how stressed I am with school, work, life, relationships, whatever it is, and, sometimes I'm like, do I really have time to do that last edit, write that last blog post, make that social media post, record that episode, invite that guest, right? It's never ending. Do I have time for that? Do I even want to do that? My favorite part is doing it anyway, because as soon as I commit to it, everything changes. My day, my week is made. I absolutely love creating the show. I love putting voices together, bringing people together, and I love talking about something that matters and doing something, even though it might be small, something that is making someone's day, even if it's only one person. That's something that I did. And I hope you guys have that in your lives too. And if not, I invite you to discover what that may be, because I can tell you from starting this podcast last May up until now, I've had the best months of my life. So definitely love just putting the show together, every element that comes with that, even the nitty-gritty stuff. All right, guys, that brings us to the end of today's episode. That wraps up our top 10 Q&A. Thank you guys again for submitting your responses and taking that time out of your day. I appreciate you. You guys, the show wouldn't be growing without you guys, so thank you for that. With that in mind, guys, please share the show with anyone you know, friends, colleagues, family. So we'll see you next week for our final episode of Season 2.